Alola Vinaka, Fiji, and a warm welcome once again to this week's episode of Speak Your Mind. I'm Louise Kaunisela. Our guest today is from Shelter Cluster Fiji, from the Ministry of Housing and Community Development, Doreen Narayan. Welcome to Speak Your Mind.
Thank you for having me on the show, Vinaka.
You're most welcome. Now, when Cyclone Winston struck on that fateful day, it was on the 20th of February 2016, a total of 40,000 homes were damaged or destroyed. So it's timely that Doreen is here to discuss the recent launch of the first ever Fiji Shelter Handbook. This is inclusive and accessible shelter planning for Fijian communities. Could you tell us in detail why and how this book was developed, Doreen?
Thank you, Luis, and thank you again for having me on the show. And this handbook, which I'm going to talk about, it's called Fiji Shelter Handbook, Inclusive and Accessible Shelter Planning for Fijians Communities. Now, if we look at why we developed this book, the whole purpose, the need for it, I'll just like to take you for 1 second. Can you imagine how the situation is post-disaster scenario? How chaotic it is, how things are flowing, everything is busy. People are thinking of what to do and all that. So one of the challenges faced by the Shelter Cluster Fiji was the absence of a country-specific tool, a guide for shelter responders actually on the guiding on the solutions and actually telling or assisting us on what are the possible solutions, what can be done. If we try to look at or have a read at shelter documents, there are a lot of good information out there. There are a lot of good documents out there at Pacific level. But if you try to find specific information relating to Fiji in Fijian context, that's quite difficult to find actually. For example, something on the shelter solutions and information on what sort of shelter kits we distribute, what sort of shelter kit or house models are Fijians okay with. So basically there was a gap of a country-specific tool which responders can basically use as a guide.
Okay, so when you say respondents, is this everyone in the country?
No, I'm specifically referring to shelter responders who basically are from the humanitarian sector.
So these are the ones that when a natural disaster happens, they're the one that moves in.
Exactly.
So could you give a few examples of who they are?
So some of the shelter responders in Fiji are Red Cross Fiji Society, Habitat for Humanity Fiji, and also IFRC. So these are primarily the key ones that work.
Yeah. So this book is for them.
This book, the target audience for this book are the shelter responders, but it can also be used by other humanitarians as well for inter-cluster coordination or as a reference guide or tool. But it has been designed primarily for shelter responders.
Oh, okay. So that is especially for them. So what is exactly meant by the part inclusive and accessible planning?
Okay. So when I say inclusive and accessible, inclusive in terms of trying to get the views of and capture views of everybody. When I say everybody, for example, when we are in communities, we are trying to speak to males, females, and the LGBTIQ plus community as well. And we are also trying to speak to elderly. We're trying to speak to people with disabilities. So it's a matter of covering all genders, people with disability, to make a very conclusive approach to this whole handbook. So
so that handbook is, has stuff in it that you can use if you're building a home for maybe a person with difficulties.
So, for example, if you are intervening a shelter, then how do you ensure that your house is accessible for people with disabilities? Instead of steps, a person with disability would prefer to have ramps. A person on wheelchair would prefer to have ramps, and a blind person would prefer to have railings to guide them inside the house.
Right.
So that's actually referring to the inclusive approach that we take. And when I say gender inclusive, when you make a house, how do you ensure that the voice of women or females are counted and inclusive? For example, I will come to the research part of it on what are some of the views of the women in our community when they look at shelter. And shelter is predominantly a male-dominated sector. right? And those who build, those who walk around it, it's mostly known as a male-dominated sector. But one thing we were very careful of, the solutions that we are actually providing in this book, for us to be inclusive of all voices and to ensure everyone is heard, and that we are able to give some practical and inclusive solutions. So that's why when I say a country-specific tool has to be something which is acceptable to Fijian communities. And I just want to say that also the whole initiative started in the absence of our guide, and the project is actually sponsored and supported by Australian Humanitarian Partnership under the Disaster Ready program. So which is for 5 Pacific Island countries, and we are starting with Fiji.
Oh, wow. Aren't we just so lucky to be starting off with us? Any reason for this?
Absolutely. Well, it's good to be in Fiji and work with it as a pilot project before moving to other countries.
Yes.
So yeah, and it's the response we've been getting from the communities and stakeholders has been fantastic. So we are actually very thankful to everyone who, gave their views and were part of this project.
Yeah, it is a blessing indeed. So this book how will you get it to the respondents? I mean,
Okay, this book
or
was just
is it compulsory that they do have this book?
Yeah, so it was just launched recently during the Pacific Resilience meeting. So it was launched on May 2nd, and we basically invited everybody from the shelter sector and shelter responders and from the humanitarian sector as a whole
Right.
to come and be part of the launch and to be able to know what exactly is in this book, what it contains, how they will be able to access it, how will they be able to use it, and also the need for this book. It's very important for us to understand on why we need this. So that was one of the approach we followed, and also the idea is not to just have a handbook and have it ready and it stops there, but the whole socializing part of it will actually start now since the book has been launched. So we will be actually meeting and gathering up with the relevant stakeholders for the awareness of it, and probably have a half-day workshop or simulation kind of exercise on how to use this handbook.
That just sounds great. On Gold FM, Speak Your Mind. We'll be back shortly. We're back on Speak Your Mind, Gold FM, only the classic hits. Our guest in the studio today is from Shelter Cluster Fiji, something pretty new for us, and she's from and it's coming from the Ministry of Housing and Community Development. And yes, we've been talking about this very useful handbook and how you've said it'll be for disaster respondents. So how will the handbook assist its readers? You know, one thing, I'm interested when I look at that. I want to see what's in there. So I'm sure anyone can download it if they want, can't
yes,
they?
it's accessible, and it's on the Shelter Cluster Fiji website, even on the Pacific Shelter Cluster website. So it's very accessible, and it comes free. You don't have to pay anything for it. So
That is just so good. I mean, who's behind this, helping us with all this?
okay, if I can just clarify, the ownership of this book actually lies with Shelter Cluster Fiji.
Okay.
So it is being endorsed by the cluster and it's owned by the cluster.
Right.
But it will be used and facilitated by the members of the Shelter Cluster Fiji, right? And again, on the background of, you asked who is behind this, and we are actually very thankful to the Australian government's AHP program, as I mentioned before, the Disaster Ready, for supporting with this initiative. And this is something which the shelter responders in Fiji needed. So just coming back on the usage of this book, prior to this book, there was, like I said, there was an absence of a specific country-specific tool. So if one flips through this book, and it is for local and overseas responders as well in disaster scenarios, and it's put together during preparedness time, which is peacetime, but it's meant to be used during response, which is after disaster.
But that's such a good backup plan.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, goodness me. I mean, after the experience that we had, well, no wonder we're the first in the 5 Pacific,
Yeah.
islands to be, having the best of this pilot project.
Yeah. So if one goes through this book, so you will be able to actually understand what sort of practical shelter solutions can be intervened in Fiji, in different communities, in different locations, and also on what kind of, we call it emergency shelter kits, that's appropriate and acceptable to Fijian communities, and what are the contents of these kits. For example, we have emergency shelter kit, we have shelter repair kit, we have cleaning kits, we have clearing kits. So what does it look like with the graphics?
Step
We
by
have
step.
it here, and what's the approximate cost of the kits, and the logistics information as well. So if anybody coming from outside Fiji and wants to respond in Fiji, so it's like a whole package of information for them, like a one-stop shop, a guide for them to be able to, okay, this is what I need to do. And if someone is interested in providing a shelter solution,
Yeah.
and shelter, Lewis, I must say, it's expensive approach. And it takes time. It takes a lot of planning in intervening such initiatives. So, and with shelter, it takes planning. So having something like that, these would be very useful for shelter responders.
It would be very much so. So, like you say, disaster respondents. If someone, like for example, loses their house, I mean, someone might have money to be able to build a home. And what about if someone has no money to build a home? So, how will that be?
But usually in disaster response scenarios, there's a lot of assistance out there. There's a lot of funding out there. So how responders usually work is they work very closely with the support from donors. So, for example, some people who have completely lost their homes, that helps comes actually without a cost to them. So it depends on the model the agency is using, the type of shelter solutions they want to do, and it also depends on the location where the need is, because the need will obviously go to severe disaster affected communities.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, that's what I thought. And I mean, what about if someone might just, last time we had a lot of people getting money from the FNPF, right? So I'm thinking maybe, if they had to do that again, they could, build a home like what you have there. But like you said, I mean, obviously after a disaster, there'll be a lot of aid. So, that's just something really nice for Fiji.
Yeah, and the way the aid works, it's the shelter responders have to be very accountable to that, in
Okay.
terms of how it's used, where it's used, who the beneficiaries are, which
Okay.
communities are they assisting, and it has to also be very justified through a very transparent reporting procedure as well.
So you have any idea how it was done in the past?
But for some of the models here, the shelter solutions, it's absolutely being practiced in Fiji. So we are not trying to create new shelter designs through this book, or we're not trying to put something in this handbook that is absolutely foreign to Fiji. But all the solutions we have here has been actually, it's a collection of different models by different agencies, mostly we have IFRC, Red Cross Fiji, and Habitat for Humanity Fiji.
Okay.
So these are the key agencies which take the lead role. And what sort of shelter solutions have they provided to communities in the past? What has worked? What has not worked? So it was about bringing together the best practices. So we're looking at best practices out there in terms of the kits, in terms of shelter. And also another very important aspect of this handbook is we're also trying to look at the process in place as well. So it's not a technical book about a technical shelter angle only, but it has lots of information about the context of our culture, how things flow in our communities, and a lot of emphasis on also on the supply chain as well. When I say processes, it's looking at the legislations, the things that work in Fiji, and also the national coordination level things. A lot of information from the National Disaster Management information is also in here, because at that point of time, there's a lot of searching for information, who's doing what, which agency is responsible for what, apart from the actual shelter intervention. So through this book, we are trying to give a guideline of the whole picture of the whole scenario and how it all that information can basically assist a responder in carrying out what they intend to do in post-disaster scenarios.
Too good. On Gold FM, Speak Your Mind. I hope you're enjoying the show. Do stay with us. We'll be back soon. Speak Your Mind on Gold FM, only the classic hits. Good to have your company. Our guest in the studio is from Shelter Cluster Fiji. I must say, very interesting information, something very good for our country. And I'd just like to ask you, Doreen, what were the activities done leading up to the first ever handbook that we're talking about?
All right, thank you. This project had 3 critical areas for collecting data in order for us to put together this handbook. So the first one was desk-based research. So under desk-based research, a lot of reading was needed to be done. We needed to review a lot of documents, and the search was to be able to know what is out there, to be able to read what is out there. And like I said, we were not trying to reinvent the wheel here, but merely it was about collecting best information or best practices out there. So the desktop research was a very important part of the project for us to find out what is out there and what can be used, even as reference materials for the handbook. So a lot of downloading and reading and research was done on that aspect. And then secondly was sector consultation. So under sector consultation, first we visited 19 communities. This is 19 communities in Central Eastern Division, Western Division, Northern Tavuni side, and including Maritime Islands as well. And you can imagine visiting 19 communities and talking to all these people. And we spoke to people in focused groups, and it was very interesting to hear what they had to say. So it was.
So can you tell us what you spoke about? What was discussed?
Okay, so for us, it was very important to know what Fijians' shelter preference are.
Okay.
So it's not about a group of shelter responders discussing amongst themselves, okay, what is good, what is best, that should go in the book. But for us, it was very important to consult the people who would be the beneficiaries at the end of any intervention, to hear from them what sort of solutions they are comfortable with and okay with. And also for us, it was very important to note that we actually encourage and build the resilience of Fijian communities and people, right? And for example, after disaster, one of the things we Fijians are very good at is building or putting up a salvaged house. Putting together salvaged materials with whatever we can find. We can create temporary shelter on our own, right? We don't actually wait for weeks and weeks someone to come and make a fancy house. But Fijians are very good at making salvaged house and putting that together, right? So that's actually you doing something on your own rather than waiting for the help.
Right.
So and that's something that came out very strongly from the communities. And like I said, we spoke to people in focus groups. And interestingly, our women have a lot of say, or are very interested in shelter as well. You might think not, but it's actually they would like to be part of the decision-making process. This is prior to actually building a shelter structure.
That's good.
Like have a say in where the kitchen should be, how far the sanitation from the house should be. And one of the findings that came out when we speak to women is they want partitions in the house. That's something for shelter responders to consider. And they want locked doors and a door that can be locked from inside. Actually, sometimes they are in situations of abusive relationships, and they need to protect themselves and their children. So some of them actually share that when you build the doors, you make something that we can lock it from inside.
There you go.
Yeah, so these are kind of perceptions and things that can come from the communities. And
very important.
Yeah, and it was very good to see them having very open and good conversations with us. And when we speak to people with disabilities, and it's actually explain their perception and what they go through in disaster scenarios and what is life like for them, and usually they are left behind and not really considered or approached or helped at the right time, assistance comes to them, but it's often delayed.
Right.
So, and one of their concerns is they want to be moving together with everybody as it happens, things, right? So, and like, for example, if shelter responders are distributing kits, then we need to make sure that we go to them, to their residents, or we make sure that it's a very inclusive approach whereby we make everyone feel counted. As long as they are disaster affected and they deserve to be assisted, it's our job to make that happen. And a lot also on the assessment bit as well. Sometimes simple things like when we are collecting data before the help arrives. So usually responders will go while assessing, they'll speak to the key persons, the head of the house, the Suangani Koro, advisory counselor. Yes, you need to speak to those people, yes, but at the same time, why are you forgetting to speak to the women of the house? Why are we forgetting to speak to the elderly, the youth? They might have different perceptions of things and give you more
And
interesting
even
data.
better information as well. I mean, that is so true.
Yes,
And I'm so glad that you're sharing this with us.
yeah. So that was community consultations, and also the other part of the sector consultation was us visiting the different organizations. These are government ministries, construction industry, hardware, shipping companies, engineers, architects, faith-based organizations, NGOs, INGOs, and those working in the DR sector, academics, institutions. So we visited a total of 70 different organizations to understand what role everybody plays during response, what are the expectations, particularly what are the challenges faced by everybody. Because when it's disaster, everyone gets involved at some point of time and everybody wants to help. And then what is it like for them? So we were trying to capture all that information in this handbook, right? So, and then the one thing that came out strongly from the private sector is that they actually would like to work more closely with humanitarians, with the shelter people as well. So in a disaster situation, normally there's lots of assistance out there, but I can say the coordination is not that close. People are doing their bits, but sometimes in isolation, sometimes in their own corners.
Right.
So the coordination needs to be much stronger. People need to come together and work. And there's a lot of willingness amongst the partners and stakeholders to work together. But it's a matter of really coming and voicing out, and taking that step.
So you've discovered so much. And this is a really good thing. Looking ahead, we really need a handbook like this. It sort of gives us a proper strategy. But we'll have more for you on Speak Your Mind. And this is Gold FM, only the classic hits, the only classic hits radio station in Fiji. Speak Your Mind on Gold FM, only the classic hits. Our guest in the studio with us from Cluster Fiji, sharing a lot of useful information and interesting as well, Doreen Narayan. Now, you were speaking about the activities that you had gotten into leading up to the first ever Fiji Shelter Handbook. Now, what other activities did you have along the way?
Yeah, so we had workshops with the disabled people's organizations, DPOs, and we also had workshops with the gender-based organizations. Now, for us, it was important to capture what the gender experts are saying, what the disability experts are saying or have already documented, and some of the research information they could share with us, because shelter responders, in order to do their work, if we are to really call it, it's a consultative and consolidated approach, then we really wanted to make it a practical one. So we had 4-day, we called it a Disability Inclusive Shelter Workshop. So it was attended by close to 10 DPOs who were part of this, and they shared a lot of good information with us. One of it, for example, is the scale of disaster is different for a person with disability than when compared to an able-bodied person. For example, a heavy rain might be absolutely okay and fine for an able-bodied person, but that same heavy rain is already a disaster for a person with disability.
Exactly.
Yeah, and when for us the actual disaster comes, then that's a bit more catastrophic level severe for a person with disability. So these are the things that we needed to understand to come on the same page and to be able to make this handbook very inclusive and what they are saying. And that was one of the interesting findings. So the other one was gender-based experts. So we had workshops with the, for example, FWRM, FWCC, and other gender organizations. We invited for us to capture what are their views, what are some of their findings, and equally it was important for us to understand, shelter responders to understand what are the different dynamics between these different groups, right? Because we are more familiar with the shelter knowledge and shelter background, and there's not that much exposure when it comes to understanding the when you unpack really gender inclusive shelter, what that really means. When you unpack disability inclusive shelter, what that really means,
Right.
if you unpack it, there's lots of interesting information in it which you need to understand. If you are responding, if you are making a house, it's not just about a building, it's not just about intervening, okay, this is a house,
And that's it.
yeah, and that's it. If you are saying it's inclusive of and accessible, then you have to speak to the right people. So we had a 5-day gender-based organization, and very interesting information came
So
from
maybe you can share a
different.
few of the information that came to your mind that really, made an impact to how you thought.
Well, first of all, we got very good response from both the shelter responders and gender-based and disability organizations as well, because they could not remember when was the last time they attended shelter and gender workshop or shelter and disability workshop.
Okay.
So that sort of environment and atmosphere and getting everybody under one roof to talk about it was a good start, I would say,
Yes.
because it is always a good start. And like, for example, if we look at sanitation and shelter, right? So our women actually see sanitation to be something to be close to the house, to be very close to the actual physical structure. But in our community, some of the communities, the houses here, the sanitation would be few meters apart. And there's a lot of issues of privacy. And we also found a lot of information in evacuation centers,
Yes.
how the Fijians are thinking that an evacuation center would look. At the moment, there's some of them said there's no privacy. Everybody is in
Exactly.
one big room.
Yes.
So something
Female, male,
yes,
children.
something they would like to see is at least have male separated, female separated, or have some sort of partitions, as not everyone is comfortable with that. Yeah. So then evacuation centers for it to there's a lot of room for improvement, I would say.
Yes.
And there's lots of good suggestions which is in this handbook which can be considered. And simple things like if we look at emergency shelter kits, right? How on the friendliness of the kits and the components of the kits, how it is to be used. And because you can't think of one gender only or one group when you are developing a kit, for example, you have to think of everybody and on the usage of it.
There you go. Excellent. Now, how long has it been in the making, this handbook?
Okay, this project actually started early last year and it had 1 year duration.
Okay.
So it comes to an end in June this year before we move further. So now since the handbook is here, our next challenge is actually to socialize this amongst the responders and try to let people know on how to actually use this book. But the actual test of whether how effective this is will be, God forbid, but if we get hit by a disaster, then the actual practicality of this would be, we'll be able to see. And this is just, Lewis, a first edition, right? We didn't have something
Okay.
like this before. So this is supposed to be a living document. It's a first edition, which we will be updating to make it current, because some of the information will obviously get outdated and will be need to update and make it current. So that will be a focus, yeah.
So have you had any feedback yet on anyone downloading it yet or approaching you since the launch, which was only just on May the
Yeah,
2nd.
we have
I
a
mean,
lot.
it's a big book. How many pages there?
It's not very long, but it
Yeah?
has just merely 87 pages, including appendix. But
Yeah.
minus that, it comes to around
Can
70
I just have a
pages.
quick
Sure.
look at it? Okay. So how much did it cost to make the Fiji Shelter
Well, we
Handbook?
actually made very limited hard copies because the idea, as I said, was to update the handbook, right?
Okay.
So, well, we spent about a couple of grands to print the limited 50 copies only.
All in a good
Yeah,
way, of
but
course.
the whole idea is to have a soft copy available and accessible to all people.
Okay.
And yeah, that's the next step as we move into other editions.
Mm.
So we'll keep that as a living document.
This
Actually,
is very nice. This is actually hard.
it's hard and it's
Like
laminated.
yeah, laminated.
It's waterproof.
Yeah, anyway, we'll get back soon, and you can find out where you can download the book or
Sure.
even get it for free, which is even better. Gold FM, this is Speak Your Mind. Speak Your Mind on Gold FM, only the classic hits. Welcome back to the program. I do hope you're enjoying it. And our guest is from Shelter Cluster Fiji, Doreen Narayan. Now, Doreen, where can we find this Fiji Shelter book, the first ever in the country?
Okay, the soft copies are available on the Fiji Shelter Cluster website, and we have it on Pacific Shelter Cluster website as well, and on the Global Shelter Cluster platform as well. So if you could share the details with the viewers, that would be great.
Okay,
And if
we
they
definitely will.
yeah, if they have any questions about this handbook, or if they would like to discuss, especially those from the sector, they could contact me.
Oh, lovely. There you go. So, just for interest's sake, those buildings that you illustrate in the book, are they cyclone proof too?
Yes,
Well,
they are.
obviously, they have to be.
They are actually Cat 4 for some of the models. We don't have a huge collection of models, house models. Like I said, it was about collecting best practices out there. So we have 5 models in this book, and these
Yeah.
are 5 that's already practiced and built by agencies, mostly by Red Cross Fiji and Habitat Fiji. So, and these are already tested models, and it has worked in Fiji, and it's appreciated also by the Fijian communities. So it's not something that's foreign or something that people are not very familiar with. But to those existing models also, there's room for improvement and development as well as we go by.
Okay. So, how long does it normally take to build a home which you have in that book?
Okay.
Or
For
by-
if we look at a core house, a core shelter, usually takes 1 week, max 1.5 weeks, with 5 to 7 key people working on it.
Oh.
So it's not that it doesn't take that long, provided.
4 to
but
7
what takes
weeks.
long is the logistics management. What takes long is
Right.
arranging for the materials and getting it all sorted, because you have to be really
Exactly.
sure of how the supply chain market goes. And in disaster scenarios, we often face shortage of material situation as well. So that's something you have to be on top of for the logistics area.
Okay. So, I mean, you said for category 4 cyclone. Why not category 5? Because Winston was category 5.
Oh, that's something for us to actually work on and develop and improve on, like I said.
Yeah.
Well, category 4 is, if we look at one of the models, Habitat Fiji models, right? So, because it has to follow a procedure and get it certified and all that. So, we'll look at improving that. But at the moment, it's Cat 4.
Well, I mean, at least it's something. But is there anything else that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, if we look at the chapters of the handbook, there are 5 critical chapters, and there's also a lot of information on preparedness as well. So even though the book is to be used during response, but it can be referred to during peacetime as well, guiding on the types of key shelter messages, shelter information, and how to build back safer. What are some of the technical tips or advice on putting together a strong house, and some of the key messages. And in the appendix, you'll also find lots of reference and guide materials as well, which those interested in knowing more about this book would find very useful.
Man, that's what I'm saying. I mean, even for me, I don't think it should be only for disaster respondents. I think it should be for everyone.
Okay.
Yeah.
Surprisingly, a lot of communities, when we did the community consultation initially, then we went back to those same communities, 19 communities, to do a community feedback exercise.
Okay.
So the feedback was actually for us to explain to them on what we collected initially from them and how we're going to use that information and how will this book be beneficial for them. And a lot of those communities actually asked us for a copy, that even they are not the target audience, but they wanted to see what it looks like, and they wanted to be they know the information from them has been captured in this book. So it was very encouraging and interesting to see that there's a lot of interest for this handbook.
So if a normal person wants to get hold of this book again, maybe you'd like to just share with us how could they? Because it's free.
Yes, it's free, and as I said, those 3 platforms, if you go to those sites, all you need to do is just download it.
Yeah.
And if you are really interested in seeing and getting a feel of how the hard copy is, yeah, you can contact me at Habitat for Humanity Fiji.
Okay.
Yeah, and we'll see how best, especially with also, we are very open to comments.
To get in contact with you, where are you?
I'm based at Habitat for Humanity Fiji. That's at Lot 1 Foster Road,
Foster Road.
Wallu Bay.
Wallu Bay. Okay, perfect. Well, it was lovely having you on the program today.
Thank you very much for your time.
Doreen, thank you for coming to speak your mind. And from Louise, we'll talk again. Until next week, take care. Bye for now.